Stay with me, little one. Just one more breath. The words tremble from Jack Mercer's lips as he kneels in the middle of a snow-covered forest, his gloved hands wrapped around a tiny German shepherd puppy no larger than a football. The puppy lies motionless against his chest. Its fur is stiff with ice. Its body is so cold it barely feels alive. Around them, snow falls in thick white sheets, swallowing the world one silent inch at a time. The wind pushes through the towering pines with a low, mournful howl, carrying the scent of frozen earth and distant with smoke. Jack can barely feel his fingers anymore. Frost clings to his beard. His knees sink several inches into the snow beneath him. But he refuses to move. He refuses to give up. Not yet. Beside him stands Ranger, an aging German shepherd whose amber eyes never leave the tiny puppy. Snow dusts the fur along his back. His chest rises and falls heavily from exhaustion. He has led Jack nearly 2 miles through the storm to this place. 2 miles through deep drifts. 2 miles through darkness and freezing wind. And now both man and dog stare at the fragile life resting in Jack's hands. Come on, Jack whispers again. Stay with me. The puppy does not respond. The silence feels endless. Jack presses the tiny body closer to his jacket, trying to share what little warmth he has left. His heart pounds beneath layers of wool and canvas. Every instinct tells him the odds are impossible. Every year in Colorado, winter claims animals that wander too far into the mountains. Nature is unforgiving. Snow does not negotiate. Cold does not care. Yet something inside him refuses to let go. Ranger steps forward and gently nudges the puppy with his nose. The old dog lets out a soft whine. Not loud, not desperate, just enough to reveal a concern that feels almost human. Jack closes his eyes for a moment. He can hear nothing except the wind and the distant creak of tree branches bending beneath the weight of fresh snow. Then suddenly a memory flashes across his mind. Another winter. Another helpless life. Another moment he wishes he could change. Pain tightens inside his chest. The kind of pain that never fully leaves. The kind carried by people who have learned how quickly everything can disappear. His eyes open again. Determination replaces hesitation. No, he says quietly. Not this time. Snow continues falling around them. Ranger watches. The puppy remains still. Yet Jack does not surrender. He adjusts his grip and rises slowly to his feet. The frozen forest stretches endlessly in every direction. The nearest road is miles away. The storm is growing worse by the minute. But somewhere behind them waits a cabin, a fireplace, and perhaps the smallest chance of a miracle. Jack looks down at Ranger. The old shepherd stares back with unwavering certainty, as if he already knows something Jack does not, as if finding this puppy was never the real reason he led him into the storm. Then, deep within the forest, beyond the curtain of falling snow, a faint sound drifts through the darkness. A sound so small it could easily be mistaken for the wind. Ranger hears it instantly. His ears shoot upward. His entire body freezes. And before Jack can react, the old German shepherd turns toward the trees and begins moving deeper into the storm. 3 hours earlier, the storm had not yet reached its full strength. Gray clouds rolled over the Colorado mountains like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the last patches of blue sky. Snow drifted lazily through the air, dusting the pine trees and covering the narrow trail behind Jack Mercer's cabin. The world felt quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that experienced outdoorsmen learn to respect. Jack stood on the wooden porch holding a mug of black coffee. Steam curled upward into the cold afternoon air. Below him, Ranger paced across the yard. The old German shepherd usually followed the same routine every winter day. A short patrol around the property. A few minutes checking the tree line. Then back inside where the fireplace waited. But today was different. Ranger refused to settle. He moved back and forth across the snow with unusual urgency. His ears stayed alert. His nose remained low to the ground. Every few moments he stopped and stared toward the forest. "What is it?" Jack asked. Ranger immediately turned and trotted toward him. His amber eyes locked onto Jack's face. Then he spun around and headed back toward the trees. The behavior repeated itself 3 times. Jack frowned. For nearly 8 years, Ranger had rarely acted without reason. Military working dogs learned discipline. They learned purpose. They did not become restless without cause. Still, the weather forecast had warned of a major winter storm moving in before sunset. Jack glanced toward the darkening sky. Not today, buddy. Ranger stared at him. The dog took several steps toward the forest. Stopped. Looked back. Waiting. Jack shook his head. We are staying close to home. Ranger whined softly. The sound surprised him. The old shepherd almost never complained. Jack finished his coffee and stepped back inside the cabin. The smell of cedar logs and wood smoke filled the room. A fire crackled inside the stone fireplace. Framed photographs lined a shelf above the mantel. Memories of another life. Another chapter. Ranger entered behind him but refused to lie down. Instead, he paced across the room. Window to door. Door to window. Again and again. Outside, snow began falling harder. Tiny flakes transformed into thick, swirling curtains. The wind rattled the glass. Jack settled into a chair with a worn book in his lap. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Ranger remained restless. Finally, the shepherd stopped beside the front door and placed one paw against it. He looked over his shoulder. Waiting. Jack sighed. You are not giving up, are you? Ranger's tail moved once. The answer was obvious. The dog returned to the door. Another soft whine escaped his throat. Jack stared at him for several moments. Deep down, he felt something uncomfortable. Not fear. Instinct. The same instinct that had kept him alive during years of service. Sometimes danger announced itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as a feeling that refused to leave. Outside, the wind howled across the mountains. Ranger stood motionless beside the door. Waiting. Watching. Certain. And for reasons he could not explain, Jack suddenly realized the old dog was not asking permission to explore. He was trying to tell him something. Jack stared at Ranger for another second before finally reaching for his winter coat, hanging beside the door. The old shepherd immediately straightened. Whatever tension had been building inside him all afternoon seemed to sharpen into focus. Outside, the storm continued gathering strength. Snow struck the cabin windows in soft bursts. The mountains beyond the tree line had nearly disappeared behind a curtain of white. Jack pulled on thick gloves, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door. A blast of freezing air rushed inside. Ranger was already moving. The German shepherd bounded off the porch and headed toward the forest without hesitation. Slow down, Jack called. I am coming. The dog never looked back. Fresh snow crunched beneath Jack's boots as he followed. Within minutes, the cabin disappeared behind them. Tall pines surrounded the narrow trail. Their branches sagged beneath layers of snow. The air smelled of sap, ice, and the coming storm. Ranger moved with surprising energy for a dog his age. Every few yards, he lowered his nose to the ground, searching. Then he pushed forward again. Jack shined his flashlight across the trail. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed a faint set of tracks crossing the snow. Small tracks, barely visible. He crouched for a closer look. They were not deer tracks, not rabbit tracks. They looked canine, young canine. His stomach tightened. The prints were already filling with snow. They had been there for hours, maybe longer. Ranger whined and continued deeper into the forest. The old dog was no longer exploring. He was following something. Jack rose and followed. The wind grew stronger as they climbed a shallow ridge. Snowflakes stung his face like tiny needles. Several times, he almost lost sight of Ranger between the trees. Yet somehow the shepherd always reappeared, waiting just long enough to make sure Jack was still behind him. Then moving again. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. The trail vanished completely beneath fresh snow. Darkness settled early beneath the thick cloud cover. Jack's flashlight beam cut through the storm in a narrow tunnel of light. Suddenly Ranger stopped. Completely still. Jack nearly walked into him. What is it? He asked softly. Ranger's ears stood tall, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Jack listened. At first he heard only the wind. Then it came again, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A tiny cry, barely more than a whisper. His heartbeat quickened. Ranger immediately pushed forward. The sound came again, weak, fragile, somewhere beyond a cluster of fallen trees near the base of a slope. Jack moved faster now. Snow reached nearly to his knees. Branches scraped against his coat. The cry drifted through the darkness one more time. Then silence. Ranger broke into a run. Jack followed as quickly as he could. When he finally reached the clearing, the beam from his flashlight swept across a partially collapsed pine tree buried beneath drifts of snow. Beneath its twisted roots was a hollow hidden from the trail. Ranger stopped at the entrance and stared inside. Jack stepped forward. Then his breath caught. Nestled beneath the snow, barely visible in the darkness, were several tiny shapes huddled together against the cold. Jack dropped to one knee beside the hollow beneath the fallen pine. Snow swirled around him, driven sideways by the wind. Ranger stood close, his body shielding part of the opening from the storm. The flashlight beam trembled slightly as Jack aimed it into the darkness. What he saw made his heart sink. Curled together against a bed of frozen needles were 5 tiny German shepherd puppies. Their small bodies were pressed tightly against one another. Snow had drifted into the hollow. Ice crystals clung to their fur. They looked impossibly small against the vast winter wilderness surrounding them. For a moment Jack could not move. Then he noticed another shape. Just beyond the puppies lay an adult German shepherd. Her sable coat was dusted with snow. She was curled protectively around the litter, as if she had spent her final strength trying to keep them warm. The sight tightened something deep inside his chest. Ranger stepped forward carefully and lowered his nose. The old shepherd sniffed the puppies one by one. His ears remained alert. His eyes never left them. Jack set the flashlight beside the hollow and reached inside. His gloves brushed against the nearest puppy. The tiny body felt cold. Far too cold. Yet when he gently lifted it into his hands, he felt the faintest movement. A weak twitch, barely noticeable. Hope surged through him. "Easy," he whispered. "Easy, little one." He checked another puppy, then another. Each one was alive, but only barely. Their breathing was shallow. Their tiny paws were stiff from the cold. Snow continued falling around them. The storm was growing stronger. They did not have much time. Then Jack noticed the smallest puppy. It lay partly separated from the others near the edge of the hollow. Motionless. Silent. His stomach dropped. He carefully picked it up. The puppy weighed almost nothing. Its fur was icy beneath his gloves. No movement. No sound. Jack stared at the tiny face. For one terrible moment, he feared he was too late. Ranger moved closer. The old shepherd gently touched the puppy with his nose. Then he looked up at Jack. There was something heartbreaking in those amber eyes. Something that felt almost like a plea. The wind howled through the trees overhead. Snow drifted into the hollow. Jack knew they could not stay. Every second mattered now. He removed his heavy coat and spread it across the snow. One by one, he carefully placed the puppies inside, wrapping them in the thick, insulated fabric. The smallest puppy remained in his hands a little longer. He searched desperately for any sign of life. Then, just as he began losing hope, he felt something. A faint flutter. So weak he almost imagined it. But it was there. A tiny heartbeat. Fragile. Determined. Fighting. Jack closed his eyes briefly. Relief washed over him. "Thank God," he whispered. Ranger's tail moved once. The old shepherd seemed to understand. Jack bundled the smallest puppy beside its siblings and secured the coat around them. Then he looked toward the dark forest stretching between them and the cabin. Nearly 2 miles of deep snow. Falling temperatures. A storm that showed no sign of slowing. He gathered the bundled puppies into his arms and rose to his feet. Ranger immediately took position beside him. The old dog glanced once toward the hollow, then toward the distant trail, as if silently saying there was only one thing left to do. Get them home. The trip back to the cabin felt twice as long. Snow fell harder with every passing minute, turning the forest into a blur of white and shadow. Jack cradled the bundled puppies tightly against his chest, shielding them from the wind as best he could. Their tiny bodies were hidden beneath layers of his coat, but he could still feel how little warmth they carried. Ranger stayed close beside him. Sometimes he moved ahead to break a path through the drifts. Sometimes he circled back to check on Jack. The old shepherd never wandered far. The storm had become fierce now. Gusts pushed against them with surprising force. Pine branches groaned overhead. Snow collected on Jack's shoulders and beard. His legs burned from the effort of pushing through knee-deep drifts. Yet he never slowed. Every minute mattered. Every step mattered. Somewhere beneath the coat, one of the puppies let out a faint cry. The sound was weak, but it brought a small measure of relief. At least some of them were still fighting. Nearly 40 minutes later, a faint glow finally appeared through the trees. The cabin. Warm yellow light spilled from the windows into the storm. Jack felt a surge of hope. Ranger saw it too and quickened his pace. By the time they reached the porch, Jack's hands were numb despite his gloves. He pushed through the front door and stepped into a rush of warmth. The scent of burning cedar filled the room. The fire crackled inside the stone fireplace. Ranger shook snow from his coat, while Jack carefully laid the puppies on a thick blanket beside the hearth. The difference between the frozen forest and the cabin felt almost miraculous. Heat, light, safety. But the danger was not over. Jack immediately went to work. He grabbed towels from a nearby closet and warmed them beside the fire. One by one, he gently wrapped each puppy, rubbing their tiny bodies to encourage circulation. Ranger lay beside them, watching every movement. The old shepherd seemed unusually focused on the smallest puppy, the same one Jack had nearly believed was gone. Minutes passed, then more. Slowly, signs of life began to return. One puppy shifted beneath the blanket. Another let out a tiny squeak. Their breathing grew stronger. Their bodies began to feel less like ice. Jack allowed himself a cautious breath. For puppies were responding. For puppies were warming. But the smallest remained still. Jack picked it up carefully. The tiny creature fit easily into both hands. Its body was warmer than before, yet something was wrong. No movement. No sound. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Outside, the storm rattled the windows. Inside, only the fire spoke. Jack stared down at the puppy. A memory surfaced without warning. A hospital room. White walls. Machines. A small hand slipping from his grasp years ago. He closed his eyes. The pain remained as sharp as ever. Time had never truly touched it. Ranger rose and walked over. The old shepherd rested his head against Jack's knee. The gesture was simple, familiar, grounding. Jack looked down at him and swallowed hard. Then he looked back at the tiny puppy. Not this time, he whispered. I am not giving up on you. He wrapped the puppy in a fresh warm towel and pulled it closer to his chest. Outside, winter continued to rage against the mountains. But inside the cabin, another battle had just begun. Jack sat on the floor beside the fireplace with the smallest puppy cradled against his chest. The cabin glowed with the warm orange light of burning cedar logs. Outside, the storm continued to sweep across the mountains, rattling the windows and burying the forest beneath fresh snow. Inside, time seemed to slow. The four stronger puppies lay wrapped in blankets near the hearth. Their tiny bodies shifted occasionally. A faint whimper. A small stretch. Signs of life. Signs of hope. But the smallest remained silent. Jack carefully rubbed the puppy through the warm towel. His movements were gentle, patient, deliberate, the way he had learned long ago that panic never solved anything. Ranger remained beside him, watching every second. The old German shepherd had not left the puppy's side since they arrived home. Every few moments he leaned forward and softly nudged the tiny bundle with his nose, as if encouraging it to keep fighting. Jack looked down at the fragile face resting against the towel. The puppy looked peaceful, too peaceful. Fear settled quietly into his chest. Not the sharp fear of danger, the heavier kind. The fear of losing something before you truly had a chance to save it. Another memory surfaced. A pink blanket. A hospital room. The scent of disinfectant. A tiny heartbeat slowing beneath a monitor years ago. Jack shut his eyes. For a moment, he was no longer sitting in a mountain cabin. He was standing beside a bed, wishing with everything he had that love alone could change the outcome. The memory hit hard enough to steal his breath. Ranger rested his head against Jack's shoulder. The warmth of the shepherd's fur pulled him back to the present. Back to the cabin. Back to the puppy. Jack swallowed and looked down again. Listen to me, he whispered softly. You do not know me. I do not know you. But you came this far. The puppy remained still. The fire crackled nearby. Snow tapped gently against the glass. You survived that storm. His voice grew quieter. You survived the cold. You survived the night. He carefully adjusted the towel around the tiny body. Do not quit now. Ranger let out a low whine. Jack smiled sadly. I know, buddy. Minutes passed. Then more. The cabin clock ticked steadily on the wall. The fire settled into glowing embers. Jack never stopped holding the puppy. Never stopped sharing his warmth. Never stopped believing there was still a chance. Then something happened. So small it would have been easy to miss. A tiny paw moved beneath the towel. Jack froze. His heart skipped. He leaned closer. Come on. Another movement. Weak. Barely there. But real. Ranger instantly lifted his head. His ears shot forward. Hope filled the room so suddenly it almost felt alive. Jack stared down at the puppy. Then he saw it. The faintest breath. A tiny rise and fall beneath the blanket. One breath. Then another. Tears gathered in his eyes before he even realized it. Ranger moved closer and gently licked the puppy's forehead. The tiny puppy twitched again, stronger this time. Outside, the storm continued to rage across the mountains. But inside the cabin, a small miracle had just taken its first breath. Morning arrived slowly. The storm had finally passed, leaving the mountains buried beneath fresh snow that sparkled beneath the pale winter sun. Golden light streamed through the cabin windows and settled across the wooden floor. For the first time in nearly 24 hours, silence filled the air. The kind of silence that comes after something difficult has been survived. Jack sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee cooling between his hands. He had barely slept. Every few hours he checked on the puppies beside the fireplace. Every few hours he made sure they were warm, fed, and breathing comfortably. Now all five lay together inside a large basket lined with blankets. Tiny sounds drifted from the bundle. Small whimpers, gentle movements, signs of life, signs of hope. Ranger lay nearby, watching them. The old German shepherd looked exhausted. Yet every time one of the puppies stirred, his ears immediately lifted. His attention never wandered far. Jack smiled. "You are taking this job pretty seriously." Ranger glanced toward him, but remained where he was. Then something caught Jack's attention. Near the front door sat Ranger's leash. Snow still clung to parts of it from the previous day. Jack stared at it for a moment. A thought slowly formed. He remembered Ranger's behavior before the storm. The pacing, the whining, the constant trips to the door, the way he had refused to settle down. Jack leaned back in his chair. "You knew something was out there." Ranger looked at him quietly. The old shepherd blinked once. Jack's gaze drifted toward the window, toward the forest beyond. Suddenly the timeline became clear. The tracks they found had already been filling with snow. The puppies had been exposed for hours before Jack discovered them. Maybe longer, which meant Ranger had likely picked up the scent much earlier. Perhaps even the day before. The realization hit him hard. While he sat comfortably inside the cabin, Ranger had been trying to tell him something. Trying to lead him into the mountains. Trying to save lives that nobody knew were in danger. Jack looked back at the dog. "You were not being stubborn." His voice softened. "You were trying to help them." Ranger's tail moved slowly against the floor. That afternoon, as sunlight filled the cabin, one of the puppies finally climbed out of the basket. Its movements were awkward and clumsy. Its legs wobbled beneath its tiny body. The little shepherd looked around uncertainly. Then it spotted Ranger. What happened next made Jack laugh for the first time in days. The puppy marched directly across the floor toward the old dog. Not toward the fireplace. Not toward the basket. Toward Ranger. When it reached him, it collapsed against his front paw and fell asleep almost immediately. Ranger lowered his head and gently rested his chin beside the tiny puppy. The image stopped Jack in his tracks. Something warm settled inside his chest. The puppy had made its choice. Somewhere between the storm, the rescue, and the long night beside the fire, it had decided exactly who made it feel safe. And Ranger, without a single complaint, seemed ready to accept the responsibility. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the mountains. Weeks passed. Snowbanks shrank beneath warmer sunlight. Water trickled through the pines where silence once ruled. The cabin felt different now. Alive. Every corner seemed filled with movement. The puppies had grown stronger with each passing day. Their legs no longer wobbled. Their eyes sparkled with curiosity. They chased one another across the living room, tumbled through blankets, and explored every inch of the property whenever the weather allowed. Yet one thing never changed. The smallest puppy remained devoted to Ranger. Wherever the old German shepherd went, the puppy followed. If Ranger rested beside the fireplace, the puppy curled against his side. If Ranger walked onto the porch, the puppy hurried after him. If Ranger stopped beneath a pine tree, the puppy sat beside him as though standing guard. Jack eventually gave the little shepherd a name. Scout. It fit perfectly. The puppy seemed determined to learn everything Ranger knew. One bright afternoon, Jack stood outside repairing a section of fence near the driveway. The sky was clear. The mountains shimmered beneath the last traces of snow. Ranger lay in the grass watching the property while Scout bounced around him with endless energy. The older dog tolerated every bit of it. Scout climbed over his paws, tugged gently at his tail, even attempted to imitate the way Ranger sat and scanned the horizon. The results were not particularly impressive. Jack laughed every time. "You have yourself an apprentice now," he said. Ranger opened one eye. Scout immediately sat straighter, as if proud of the title. The weeks continued to pass. Spring arrived fully. Wildflowers appeared across the meadows. The air smelled of fresh earth and pine sap. One morning, Jack opened the front door and found all 5 young shepherds waiting on the porch beside Ranger. The sight stopped him cold. The puppies sat in a crooked line. Ranger sat in the center, calm, watchful, dignified. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. It looked less like a group of puppies and more like students gathered around their teacher. Jack shook his head and smiled. Then Scout did something unexpected. The young shepherd left the group and trotted directly toward Ranger. He gently pressed his head beneath the older dog's chin. Ranger lowered his muzzle and rested it briefly on top of Scout's head. The gesture lasted only a moment, yet something about it felt profound. Jack stood quietly watching. The morning breeze moved through the grass. Birds sang from the nearby trees. Sunlight warmed the porch boards beneath their feet. For the first time, he realized the rescue had become something larger than survival. Ranger had not only saved lives in that storm, he had given those lives direction, purpose, belonging. The old shepherd looked toward the mountains for a moment. His amber eyes reflected the bright spring sky. Then Scout settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The younger dog seemed completely content, as though he had already decided exactly who he wanted to become when he grew up. By early summer, the mountains looked nothing like they had on the day of the storm. The snow was gone from the lower slopes. Wildflowers painted the meadows in shades of gold, purple, and white. Warm sunlight poured across the valley each morning, filling the cabin with light and life. What had once felt empty now felt like a home again. The 5 young shepherds had grown quickly. Their paws seemed too large for their bodies. Their energy appeared endless. Every day brought new adventures. Yet Scout remained different. While the others chased butterflies through the grass or wrestled beneath the pine trees, Scout stayed close to Ranger. Always watching, always learning. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Jack sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea resting beside him. The air smelled of fresh earth and pine. Crickets sang from the meadow below. Ranger lay near the steps while Scout rested beside him. The younger shepherd was no longer the fragile puppy Jack had carried through the storm. He had grown stronger, braver, healthier. Yet whenever Ranger shifted position, Scout immediately looked up. The bond between them had only deepened with time. Jack smiled and shook his head. "You know, buddy," he said softly to Ranger, "I think you saved more than puppies that day." Ranger lifted his head. His amber eyes reflected the golden light of sunset. Jack looked out across the property. Months earlier, he had spent most evenings alone with his memories. The cabin had been quiet then, too quiet. Some wounds had followed him for years. Some losses had never fully healed. But now laughter seemed to exist everywhere. In the sound of paws racing across the yard. In the joyful chaos that greeted him every morning. In the simple comfort of knowing he was no longer carrying everything by himself. The puppies had changed the rhythm of his life. And Ranger had started it all. As darkness slowly settled over the valley, Scout stood and walked toward the edge of the porch. He looked out over the meadow exactly the way Ranger often did. Alert, calm, thoughtful. The resemblance made Jack laugh. Ranger glanced toward the younger dog and slowly rose to his feet. For a moment, the 2 shepherds stood side by side, facing the mountains. The old teacher and the eager student. The dog who had spent a lifetime serving others, and the one just beginning his journey. A gentle breeze moved through the grass. Fireflies began appearing near the fence line. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell echoed faintly through the valley. Jack leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. Peace settled over him. Not because life had become perfect, not because pain had disappeared, but because he finally understood something important. The things that save us rarely arrive the way we expect. Sometimes they arrive covered in snow. Sometimes they arrive on 4 paws. And sometimes the smallest act of mercy becomes the beginning of an entirely new life. Ranger slowly lowered himself into the grass. Scout immediately curled beside him. The other puppies soon followed, forming a sleepy circle around the old shepherd. Above them, the first stars appeared in the summer sky. Jack watched the scene for a long time. Then he smiled. Deep down, he knew the truth. The storm had ended months ago, but the miracle it brought would stay with them for years. And beneath a sky filled with stars, surrounded by life that almost never had the chance to exist, one faithful German shepherd closed his eyes knowing that every step into the snow had been worth it.